We got pretty geeky there, didn't we? Hopefully the audience is up for
That's exactly what I want.
The ride
no,
through.
that's exactly what I want.
Hey friends, welcome back to another episode of the Tech Bomb podcast. In this one, I speak to Will Critchlow, one of the most popular and prolific people in SEO. Will has been doing SEO for 15 years. He founded Distilled in 2005, organizer of Searchpilot, and one of the people who have been doing SEO for the longest time. In this episode, Will Critchlow and I speak about anything related to SEO A/B testing, testing frameworks, and what it means to be 15 years in the SEO industry. So make sure you listen to the end, give me a thumbs up on YouTube, and a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. Enjoy. 3, 2, 1. Will, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
It's all my pleasure. I want to start with the question about Searchpilot. How was Searchpilot born?
So Searchpilot got started originally as part of R&D at Distilled. So Distilled was the company that I founded with Duncan Morris in 2005, so SEO agency initially. And then in the last few years, we'd been building an R&D capability. And out of that grew what was originally we called the Distilled ODN, Optimization Delivery Network. And it had become so it started as an R&D project, essentially. Can we do this? Is it valuable? Is it a good thing? And became a business unit. So we ended up with it having its own P&L internally within Distilled and its own revenue, its own customers. And then earlier this year, so in January 2020, we spun that business unit out as its own independent company, and in the process rebranded it as Searchpilot. And and as part of that transaction, we actually sold the rest of the business, so the consulting and conferences business, to Brainlabs.
SEO experiments have become absolutely crucial nowadays, I would say, to understand really how SEO works, because rankings have become so much more fluid. Everything is so much more customized to the actual vertical you operate in or the keyword. I think Google gets really good at not applying the same ranking signals to the same degree to every kind of keyword and ranking or category. So Searchpilot basically is a solution for you to run your own SEO experiments in-house. Is that fair to say?
Yes, that's right. We saw that some of the biggest tech companies in the world were building this capability themselves. And what we've tried to do is build a platform so that a more mass market approach, more companies can do this, and many more websites can run their own tests and their own experiments. And we also help them do that. So in some cases, it's kind of self-service. So the advanced SEO teams in-house at some of our customers are running their own tests completely. And then we also have a professional services team at our end, building on our years of consulting experience. We have folks, specialists in-house at our end, who are helping some of our customers run tests, and in some cases actually just building and designing tests for them.
Can you walk us through the very basic steps of how to think about SEO experiments and how to set them up?
So I think a lot of people are probably familiar with the idea of testing, A/B testing, as it applies in conversion rate optimization or user experience testing, where we take the audience and separate the audience into groups and show some people one version and some people a different version, and see how they convert and so forth. The idea of SEO A/B testing is somewhat similar, and certainly relies on some of the same statistics and kind of mathematical approach. But the key insight we have to realize is that there's essentially only, if we're testing for Google's preferences, only one Google. And so we can't separate our audience in the same way. So what we do is we separate pages. So instead of separating the audience and making changes, we separate a group of similar pages. And so the kind of testing we run, kind of SEO A/B testing we run, typically runs on a site section. So rather than just on an individual page. And so we take a site section of similar pages. Think, for example, a group of product pages on an e-commerce website is a classic example. And we make changes to some of the pages, keep other pages unchanged. And those changes are for everyone. So there is no cloaking. This is not being shown only to Google or any of these kinds of things. These changes are made to some pages. Other pages are kept as the control. And then we compare the performance of those pages with some advanced statistical techniques and looking at their history and all those kinds of things. And that takes account of all kinds of other confounding variables like seasonality, competitor changes, Google algorithm updates, all of these other things, and enables us to get to a scientific evaluation of whether any change in performance is as a result of the changes that we made to those pages. That's kind of the basic fundamentals. We get then into more advanced details where we start thinking about things like full funnel testing, which is where we consider not only the SEO performance of those pages, but also the conversion rate at the same time. And this is kind of my favorite way of thinking about this stuff, where we're really trying to get to the root of, is there any conflict between user experience and Google preferences, search engine preferences? And to the extent that there is, how do we thread that needle, right? How do we find the best possible combination of user experience and search performance? And that's what I find kind of really exciting. And the great thing about running full funnel tests is that they combine the test I talked about with some cookie technology, which means that any individual user sees a consistent site-wide experience. So depending whether they came in on a control page or a variant page, they then see a consistent site-wide experience. So it's actually kind of the best version of SEO testing, if you like.
You mentioned the point of statistical aspects, or just the statistical component of SEO testing, which I think is something that needs a little bit of attention. And I think it's also something that some SEOs shy away from. So can you tell us a little bit about how Searchpilot helps SEOs pick the right sample size, understand when a test is statistically significant, when the result is statistically significant?
Yeah, absolutely. So we focus on, first of all, building the test that is most likely to be significant. And so the way we do that is that at the outset, so I mentioned that we test on a site section. What we then do is we have to obviously pick which pages in that site section before we start, which pages are going to be the control and which pages are going to be the variant pages. And we do that with a form of stratified sampling. So what we're trying to do is essentially pick two groups of pages that are statistically similar at the outset before we start as possible. So they have the same kinds of metrics in terms of traffic levels, in terms of variance in traffic, in terms of seasonality, all of these kinds of things, because that helps us identify that any changes are as a result of our changes. And it's really important because if you just randomly distribute a large site section, you can run into kind of troubles, because the kind of power law nature of the web means that some pages will dominate that sample. And so it's kind of important to stratify it and try and make sure that you start with groups that are as similar as possible. And so then we run a form of it's based on some neural network technology, and it's a fundamentally kind of Bayesian approach where we're kind of saying we're able to look regularly and see how the test is going and make the call about whether it's reached significance or not, which is not the case with certain kinds of traditional statistical approaches where you just have to set an end date and you need to wait until then to make the call. And so yeah, so our system spits out a current uplift confidence interval, and so essentially when that confidence interval gets above 0, when the entire confidence interval is positive, we can then call that test with statistical confidence and say, we believe that there's X% chance that this is a positive uplift with a most likely uplift of however many sessions a day or a month. This is the kind of tough area to get into, because what we've tried to do is take some really quite complicated mathematical statistical approaches and make the output as simple as possible, and make it so that, yes, obviously there's complexity under the hood, but how can we make it so that what we're seeing in the analysis is a chart that is easy to interpret, works in the way that you'd kind of intuitively expect, and is as accessible as possible to a broad audience.
Can you talk a little bit about the limitations of SEO testing, and specifically who can test and who maybe isn't ready? Because the way that I understand it is that the smaller the impact of a change or a treatment that you make, the more traffic you basically need, right? So if you make some change or a treatment to a very impactful ranking signal, say the meta title, then you might not need as much traffic or as large of a sample size. But obviously there is a certain sweet spot. And so I'm just curious about your take and your experience about like who's really eligible for SEO testing and who has to, and maybe who might not be ready.
For sure. So there's two key variables in my mind, which is, one is the one you identified about traffic levels. And yes, of course, the bigger a site in traffic to the site section, that you're talking about, the more subtle the more subtle an effect you can detect. And that's true of any kind of testing. I mean, that's the same with conversion rate testing or any of the rest of it, where, Google might be testing or Amazon might be testing subtle variations in color that would just not be detectable on a normal sized website. So that's one element, but that's not unique to SEO testing. I think the thing that is more unique or more specific to SEO testing rather is that we do rely on there being a certain size of website in terms of number of pages as well. So the kind of testing that we're running doesn't allow you to test, for example, a homepage. So it's fundamentally not a good approach, or not even a possible approach for something like a B2B SaaS website, right? In fact, Searchpilot's own website is not amenable to the kind of testing that we do, because we simply don't have hundreds or thousands of pages with a similar layout, similar page template, that kind of stuff. So I think either if websites don't have those pages, or if their performance is dominated by a handful of pages, homepage, again, in B2B SaaS, for example, your conversions may come from a too small a set of pages to enable sensible testing. Our kind of rule of thumb is having 1,000 organic sessions a day to the site section that you want to test on. And at that level, we can detect, multiple percentage point uplifts and so forth. So, we're probably not able to detect a 0.1% uplift, but nor do we need it to be a 25% uplift before we can spot it, if that makes sense. So I think you can kind of work backwards from there and say, well, is it significant to the business to get a couple of percent uplift on this site section? Does it get at least 1,000 organic visits a day? If both of those things are true, then it's worth running tests like that. My kind of stepping back from it a second. So obviously that's the way we're going at Searchpilot. That's the way that our SEO A/B testing methodology works. I'm kind of obviously also interested in the broader ecosystem and how we as SEOs think about it, how we think about how Google works, how also we make this stuff accessible. That, like the insights that we find, how we make those accessible to smaller businesses or smaller websites as well. And I think there are things they can do. I think if it is sometimes worth doing before and after tests on individual pages. I still think it's worth being data driven, even though you can't perfectly capture seasonality, competitor updates, Google impact, the Google algorithm updates. It's still worth being data driven about that stuff. And then the other thing, and this is the area where I guess Searchpilot is trying to help, although it's not our kind of commercial mission, is we're trying to publish a lot of this data. So we're trying to say, here's what we're finding when we're running these tests on massive websites. And, as you said at the outset, you can't just take a result and kind of naively assume that that's how Google would treat a page on a tiny website, for example. But we hope, as we build that library up, we hope to show things that often work, things that very rarely work, and kind of nudge the whole industry in a good direction towards the most beneficial changes.
Talk about these case studies for a moment, because since you started publishing them this year, I've read every single one, and I think they're some of the most valuable SEO content out there right now at the moment. No, they're amazing. I think this is exactly that's the most valuable stuff out there. Period. It's like sharing experiments, and I think in the earlier days of SEO, there was a lot of sharing of kind of anecdotal observations going on, and that was super useful. And then Google became a lot smarter or a bit more complex to understand, and then that went away. And I feel like now it's coming back with exactly those kind of case studies. What is kind of what was the test that surprised you the most, or maybe the case study that surprised you the most, where the result maybe went against your understanding of things or against your intuition?
Well, I mean, there've been a lot that have gone against intuition, which I guess is a good thing. It shows that it is actually worth running these tests. So the biggest surprise for me, although it's not the most, I think there's two different ways of looking at this. The biggest surprise and the one that I've learned the most from, I guess. So I think the biggest surprise was, so we've been able to, in some cases, and we're going to be talking more about this, I think we've got some case studies coming up, where we have tested entire new templates, entire site redesigns. So rather than just tweaking a particular HTML element or adding or removing a particular piece of content, we have been able to test an entirely different page. And obviously a group of pages, as I said, within a site section. And that's thrown up some really interesting results. It's obviously not as simple to to draw lessons from it, because so much changes at once. It's not controlled in the sense of like, we're just making this little tweak, let's see what that does. It's kind of saying, oh, well, we have an entirely different version. If this outperforms, we don't necessarily know which of these many things it was. But probably the most surprising for me was where we ran a test like that. It moved from pure HTML to a client-side rendered React template, and performance improved. Organic search performance improved. Now, we've run plenty of other tests that have highlighted problems with JavaScript rendering and indexing and so forth. And my hypothesis, my suspicion is that this is not that React was better. This is other things about the design were significantly better than the old version. In particular, the actual final rendered DOM was a much cleaner and faster HTML template. So I suspect it's there, but nevertheless, like, you'd never have got me betting, oh yeah, the React version will win before that test was run. So that's probably the most surprising. I think in terms of what the ones where we've learned the most, it's probably been a repeated sequence of just how hard it is to write better title tags. Like, it sounds so simple, but and I feel like, I'm sure you've been in the same boat. I feel like everybody who's been in SEO for any period of time has made recommendations to clients or to, if you work in-house, to your own website of just like, hey, we should update, we've done this keyword research, we should update these title tags. And it's a classic agency recommendation, right? Here's a keyword, here's a bunch of keyword research, here's a bunch of pages. We're just gonna do the thing, right? Just simple now, right? It's really not simple, and to actually outperform the existing title tags, and worse than that, they've been some of our biggest negative tests. So some of our worst outcomes have been apparently sensible title tag updates. Like, you do some keyword research, you find a way of phrasing something that seems better, you roll it out to a template, and minus 20%, 25% organic traffic in some cases. And my colleague Emily Potter gave a whole presentation where about half the presentation was just showing cases where essentially very, very experienced SEO consultants on our team were just failing to write title tags that were better than the ones that were already there. And so that's the kind of embarrassing one, I think, where people they're like, I've got 15 years of SEO experience, and I dread to think how many times I've written in a recommendation that we should incorporate keyword research into our title tags, and that's not always a good idea.
Yeah, 100%. It's funny because we made the same observations. I made the same observations many times at different companies. First of all, it's hard to write good title tags. Second of all, the title that you think is best is not always the best from Google's or the user perspective. And third of all, there's way more potential in title tags than most people think. I think especially with these scalable sites that you alluded to, I don't think they make, they use half of the potential that most title tags bear. And it's very interesting because one very, very big website out there that I'm not going to name actually goes against all known parameters of optimal title tags. Their title tags are 100 characters long, outperform anything else. They tested that systematically. And so I think this, it kind of goes back to a point that I'm very bullish on, which is humbleness in the SEO industry. And I honestly think that, or I would love to see an experiment where, not an actual like SEO experiment, but a real life experiment where SEOs would put money behind their bets. Right? Like, how would SEOs would make decisions if they would have to bet $1,000 that their recommendation was the best one? I don't think most people would. I think, and I think that's kind of like a false arrogance or like a bias that a lot of SEOs suffer from. I certainly did, where you think that this is certainly the best recommendation. But these tests allow us to spot check or to falsify that, right? That we don't always know the best answer, and that instead of trying to have a hard stance on a specific recommendation, you should have hard stance on testing certain things and then letting the data speak for itself, more or less.
Yeah, for sure. And I don't think it's actually unique to title tags here. I think what we're seeing with the title tag tests is just, as you said, title tags are so powerful, right? They're such a single big thing where we can see that delta so easily. But this is there in every recommendation. I totally agree with you. And I think it's not only the that kind of, I guess, arrogance of thinking you got it right, but it's just the depth of complexity is so hidden from us. And I think it's hidden from us by necessity, because we can't just get our heads around the scale of the data. It's hidden from us because the data just simply doesn't exist, or at least not in a form that we can access it. And yeah, I think that the classic one for me is just, it's really hard to get your head around how long the long tail is. That's just continually mind-blowing. And the thing that I think the manifestation of that is it's always inevitably tempting. We're just human. We go and look at individual rankings. We go and look at some head terms. We go and look at how our rankings have changed in our rank tracker, without even if we kind of intellectually we know that this is a tiny fraction. This is the observable portion of the universe, and the universe is immense. It's really hard to get our heads around that scale. And I think that's the other thing that's happening here quite often, is that, especially when you do keyword research driven stuff, is you're optimizing for the ones you can think of without taking account of the extreme variation that actually exists across the universe of search tests.
Absolutely. And it starts with having very flawed data itself, right? The idea of search volume, very incomplete, very narrow view on what's actually going on. How often has it happened that a business actually started creating content just based on intuition, editorial, guidance, or journalistic approaches, and without even looking at search volume, and then they do a really good job at ranking for SEO? Or how often has it happened that you optimize for a keyword that has very low search volume, and then it turns out the page ranks for all sorts of keyword variations and semantic keywords, and it's actually so much more traffic that's coming through.
Yeah, and that's why we, because there's also an interesting question when it comes to SEO testing. In a sense, if you're trying to discover ranking factors, it makes more sense to look at rankings, right? So, we made these changes. Did these rankings change? There is some validity to that. Unfortunately, so our approach is much more to look at, we look at rankings to explain things, but in terms of picking winners, we look at organic traffic. And the reason for that is because you can only ever look at a small subset of rankings, whereas organic traffic captures the entire long tail. There's a lot of complexity in there. And one of the things that we would love to be able to do as we evolve our product is think about so rankings can be a leading predictor of success, right? So if you move from ranking position 48 to position 45, you're probably not going to be able to detect that in your organic traffic. In theory, looking at rankings should be able to tell us that something is a good idea, even if it's so marginal that we can't detect it in the traffic yet. And I'd love to build something that kind of captures all those things together. But at least at the current state of play, there's no way of getting to the extreme long tail that you'd need to be able to be confident that 48 moving to a 45 wasn't offset by a different 35 moving to a 39 or whatever it might be. So that's why we take that approach.
And I love that. I think in my mind, I'm super passionate about this. This is the kind of modern way to think about SEO in my mind, right? And not a lot of people take that mindset out there, and I love that you push that forward. I think it's absolutely crucial for to be able to keep track with SEO and actually make good calls and to advance the whole SEO community. So regarding the actual experiments, how do you set those up? I mean, one side of that is obviously you work with some, of your closest clients, I assume, and they give you the permission to publish these case studies. But how does that work? I mean, you have an onboarding team or a services team that helps clients run these experiments, right? Do you then talk to them and you're like, hey, could we maybe publish some of that on our blog? Like, how does all of that work?
Yeah, so we have different kind of levels of permission needed as we go through different levels of detail, right? And so it ranges from, there are some where we want to be able to put the customer's name on it and describe the exact change to the actual HTML template, all the way through to the other extreme of saying, hey, we ran a test that focused on a particular kind of structured data and it was positive or whatever, and there's quite a big spectrum in there. And so we have everything ranging from, some customers who say, you can write up the results, but just don't share our traffic data and don't share our our brand name, through to others that are happy to actually do co-branded full-on case studies. There's quite a range there. And so, yes, it comes ultimately out of our professional services team, who are at the moment involved in a lot of those tests, whether it's in all the way from ideating them through to analyzing them, or in some cases just supporting the customer side teams that are doing that. But it's one of the big flywheels that we're trying to push, is trying to say, actually, we want to for most of our full service customers, the kind of bigger customers, we're essentially writing everything up as a case study, even if it's only for internal use, even if it's only for that customer, and then they can use it in their internal reporting. They can use it in their their board decks or whatever they might need. And so we're trying to produce these all the time. And so then it's just a question of saying, well, which ones are interesting? Which ones have a good story behind them? Which ones do we think the community can learn from? And then either go to the extreme anonymized end or the extreme kind of client sign off end to get the logo on it and all the rest of it.
I love those. Yeah, please keep them coming for a long time, because I certainly
we plan to. Yeah, definitely, for sure. We see this as the kind of our unique content marketing advantage, right? So this is why I refer to it as a flywheel. Like, we feel that the more we can write these things up and have them kick around internally at our customer site, externally on the internet, the more people get on side with our way of doing this. There's our way of thinking about how you analyze SEO performance, and it's good for us, we think. And like you say, it's also the resource I wish had existed before we had this tool. So I would have subscribed to this email list in an instant when I was running an agency. And so once again, I feel like I can. I'm enough in the target market that I know we're producing something of value there.
For sure. Certainly. What would you say is the biggest thing that people are missing when it comes to setting those experiments up? Like, what is the thing that your services team has to help out with the most, or that the biggest mistake that you see companies maybe not using Searchpilot?
I don't know if there's a particular thing I would point to that our team has to help our customers with. Like that tends to be, I think their biggest value out there is thinking of great things to test. Actually, it's kind of more on the SEO side than it is on the testing side. So it's trying to find, and this is from my friends in the conversion rate optimization world, this is very similar to anybody running tests anywhere. It's kind of, you have to encourage people to think a bit bigger, to think very creatively, to think differently when you're making a test recommendation than a flat out recommendation, right? If you're just saying, we think this is better, you should do this, the level of certainty required, or the level of confidence required, is very different to, here's a crazy idea, why don't we just see if this is better? And so that it's some of those mindsets, some of that coaching, that's probably where we see the biggest value add. I think when you look outside of just our tests, and I look at the kind of the broader SEO industry and other folks who are running these tests, I think the biggest thing is just challenges on the statistical side of it. So either not running controlled tests. So what people call tests are in fact just changes, right? And I think, and as I said earlier with the smaller sites, I don't want to knock that. I think it's a very valuable thing to do, to make a change and then look and see what happened. Like that, I don't want to kind of, I don't want to say it's a bad idea, but I also think it's important that when you, especially if you're publishing the results of that, especially if you're trying to educate the audience and the community about what you did and whether it was a good idea, there's a lot of caveats that have to go with that. And actually, we're very sensitive to this in our case studies as well. You'll notice a lot of us talking about why we think this might have been the case in this specific case, rather than necessarily trying to draw, always do this lessons that are very broad brushstroke. And actually, I guess if I had to sum it up as one thing, that's the thing. It's people try and draw lessons that are broader than the data supports. And really what we've found is tests are valid in the context they were run, on the site they were run on, that kind of stuff. And yes, we can try and draw broader recommendations from that, but we can't necessarily draw kind of firm scientific conclusions that will hold in other domains. And so, yeah, I think that's what I want to encourage more of. It is just that level of critical thinking. And I think it's not just in testing, across SEO generally, just stepping back and when somebody, there's a lot of misinformation out there, whether it's on Twitter, in forums, on Facebook, on Reddit, conferences, coming from Googlers. Like there's many places where you can find things that are not quite true. What I try and encourage our team, and I would encourage everyone, is just have that, apply a level of your own critical thought to that. Try and understand, why could that be true? Why might that not be true? Go back to first principles. Is there an information retrieval reason why that should be true? And we actually have guidelines internally about how we guide our customers to make different business decisions, even under the same statistical answer, depending on the strength of our hypothesis and what supports it, right? So if we have a very, very strong reason to think something might be true, and there's it's information retrieval, good practice, and so on and so forth, and then you get a somewhat neutral, or you get a neutral result, you may still choose to roll that out because it's good hygiene, it's good for in general, in principle, if you do this repeatedly, it's going to be good for your website. In contrast, if you get a strong you get a statistical confident result that is a complete surprise or goes against your intuition, that's a great time to step back and say, A, like try and understand it, B, look for the confounding reasons why it might not be true, but C, also potentially rerun it or run a variation of it or sense check it and try and make sure that that it holds together as you, because ultimately what we're trying to drive is business results, not just exciting headlines on case studies.
Preach. There was so much truth in that statement. So thank you for that. And I want to talk about your 15 years of experience in SEO, but I want to allow myself one last question about this, about SEO testing. You mentioned that a lot of people have a hard time actually finding the thing to test. How do you best think about identifying what SEO experiments to actually run?
I think we try to draw from multiple different pots of ideas. So this is also a great example of diverse teams outperforming individuals or homogenous teams. Right, get ideas from different places. Get ideas from not just your SEOs, but your content people and your technical people, and a wide range of inputs can be really valuable here. So we will look from the kind of classic best practice technical audit type recommendations, kind of checklist type stuff. We'll look at kind of content driven ideas, particularly search intent focused ideas. So what are these pages for, and are they matching that intent as closely as they could? We'll look for kind of the more out there ideas. If we were going to do something different, what would that look like? And we'll also do quite a lot of competitor type research and thinking. That's one that I particularly value, is when you put together a presentation that shows, hey, across this kind of area of search, there's 3 broad attacks, right? So think in travel, there's like the OTAs, there's the individual, whatever it be, airlines or hotels or whatever else, and there's the media companies. And each of them are producing different kinds of content to satisfy the same kind of intent in some cases, or at least the same kind of keywords. And sometimes those keywords have multiple intents. Sometimes people are doing more research, sometimes they're more commercial, etc. And so it can be fascinating to say, what can we learn from our search competitors who are not our direct competitors? So, if you're an OTA, what can we learn from the operators or the media companies? And sometimes it can be worth saying, what can we learn from our direct competitors? Are we missing something? You mentioned the site you were talking about with the extremely long title tags. Well, if you see one of those in your industry performing really well, that's a kind of classic place to get an idea. So I think that there is a lot of art as well as science in this, and one of the things that we try and do is, and I would recommend organizations that are trying to get good at this, is build a swipe file as well. So kind of documentation is your friend. Build a list of things you tested on other pages, kinds of tests that are working for you, tests you want to run, and we often have a kind of combination of things that we wish we knew. So Google releases FAQ schema. Well, we want to know, is that likely to be a good thing on your website or not? So that kind of funnel of ideas can come from many places.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that. Now, touching on your longstanding experience in SEO, I think it's over 15 years by now. You recently wrote an article on Moz titled 15 years in SEO is a long time. And just I'm sure most listeners have actually read that article, but if you had to point out what some of the biggest changes are in the last 15 years, and there are many, but what are the ones that come to mind first? Like how do you think the industry, the craft and art has changed the most over the last 15 years?
So while a lot has changed, there's a surprising amount that is recognizable as similar, right? Like that, I think that I'm constantly amazed by both bits. The thing that keeps me engaged and interested in working in this industry for this long is the change, and is the curiosity that we can delve into, what's new and what works, and what works, what doesn't, and so forth. But on the flip side, I probably gave a presentation in, I don't know, 2006 or 2007 that said, that talked about search intent and whether Google can crawl and index your site effectively, and whether you are demonstrating the right authority. And if you had those things, then you're set up pretty well, right? And that's true in 2020 as well. So it fell in eras for me. So for me, there was that kind of early 2000s, Google coming from nowhere, dominating the search engines that used to exist before that. And really that was all about PageRank, right? That was the innovation. PageRank was the innovation. And that meant that links were so incredibly powerful. And that for me was that first era. Then the kind of reaction to that, I think, was realizing that actually the unique value that PageRank brought Google wasn't solely about ranking things better. It was about the fact that they could rank documents well on a much, much bigger web corpus than anyone else could, right? So if you think about like a human curated search engine, works incredibly well on a web that is 100 pages, right? If there's only 100 pages, ask a human. But when you get up to web scale, Google, that was where Google's advantage really shone. And that's where PageRank really worked. And what the next realization, I think, was Google, and we didn't see this at the time, but as you look back on history, Google invested everything they had in making the web bigger, right? They literally funded the creation of a lot of the web through AdSense, right? They were paying people to write long tail content. So make the web bigger and get better at indexing it than anybody else. So Google built a bigger index than anybody else had, and broadly speaking, pumped their revenue back into the engine that made the web bigger again. And that led to the incredible era of, I would say, 2007 to 2010, of literally, if you have a database that doesn't exist on the internet, put it on the internet and let it get indexed. Question mark profit, right? Like, or find a way to create a database that didn't exist before. And it's that era that produced everything from TripAdvisor to Zillow in the US, Zoopla in the UK, all of those kind of people who are essentially creating or publishing databases that had never been published before. And it was enough to just have long tail content. Then the backlash to that comes along, which is low quality content. And you see the kind of era of content farms, demand media, eHow, all of that kind of stuff, duplicate content, literal scraping of content. And if you go back and read Hacker News threads from that era, you'll see people complaining about Stack Overflow being outranked by Stack Overflow scrapers in Google search results. And that, of course, led to Panda and then later Penguin and so forth. And so we then start entering the era of content quality. So it goes links, it goes content, it goes content quality, and into link quality, right? So obviously through that whole era, they're battling spam of all kinds, whether it's content spam or link spam. The next wave that we were late to, I think, was mobile, and that we all thought it was becoming a big thing 2 years after Google was all in, I think, realistically, because they'd seen it in their own data, and same with Facebook. I'm probably missing, I feel like I'm missing something else, but anyway, and then getting into the eras of machine learning and artificial intelligence, where if you go back to 2010, you find presentations from Google as talking about how they don't use that stuff in organic search. That they wanted to understand their own algorithms. They were okay using it in paid search because they had a clear thing they were optimizing for, which was essentially revenue. But they were against it in organic search. And then, of course, there was simultaneously the need for it and the capability of it both increased. And that was then there was a lot of people turnover. So if you look, I forget the exact timings, but 2014 onwards, you see a lot of leadership changes and a lot of senior technical leadership changes. And the new guard are the machine learning guard, essentially. And clearly that's where they're all in right now. And so, yeah, you get to kind of the content understanding and intent understanding end of things. And this is why we're all in on testing is I think the only way to operate sustainably long-term at scale in that environment is to you can't just apply those kind of cookie cutter recommendations. You have to be testing.
100%. I think that there was the change of the old guard that was led by Amit Singhal, then over to Ben Gomez and Jeff Dean and a couple of other people as well.
Briefly, John Gianandrea, I think wasn't there very long, but actually was an ML guy. And yeah, Jeff Dean, I think, is the underpinning, probably quietly behind the scenes through all of that. Of course, I mean, there was some scandals buried in there. Like, it's impossible to tell exactly who got pushed out for what reason. And so, it's not necessarily that changing the guard was all technology driven. They certainly parted ways with some folks that they wanted to part ways with. But yeah, you look at the folks who were in charge in a decade ago and compare it to Jeff Dean's team, for example, and you see that pretty clearly.
Yeah, and it's very interesting. I do remember an article on one of the big publishers. I don't remember exactly which one it was, when RankBrain came out around 2016, and there was a very subtle mention where some Googler said that it was kind of this transition from an old guard to a new guard. The old guard was led by Amit Singhal, and basically they built the algorithm after his intuition or his understanding, which they said was amazing, right? And he said that he just intuitively understood search on a deeper level than most people. But as you said, then they switched to a machine learning approach where the data basically makes the right calls. And I think in some cases, not in all cases, but in some cases it might even be hard for Google to understand why the machine makes a certain change. But basically they feed the machine problems, and then the machine figures out what the best solution for it is.
Yeah, so I would probably split that. I think there's a third era in this. There's the first era, which is the we know why we've tuned the machine to work this way, right? So yeah, like you say, Amit Singhal's intuition, definitely. There's a era before them, and then machine learning is the end state. I think there's an era in the middle, which is it's still deterministic algorithms that we understand, where we've tuned the parameters, but we don't know why this parameter is better than that parameter. So I think they did go through a phase in the middle where they were repeatedly testing different tweaks to those parameters. And in fact, there's a great comment I found buried in an old Hacker News thread from a Googler who'd left a few years prior, who said, I think he was there in 2008, something like the late 2000s, who said he had an eye-opening moment where he wrote some code. He had a version that he thought was going to work. And he went to someone like Amit, who said that actually he wanted him to take the square root of one of these parameters. And he said, like, why? Like, I don't really get it. Like, I don't have any intuition about why the square root would be better. And the answer was just basically we needed to not. It wasn't really based in information retrieval. It was like, oh well, we just need this kind of performance, and then what we'll do is we'll test it. Right, so we'll go and see if these search results are better with the parameter like this. And if they are, we'll use it. We don't need a reason why. And maybe it's not square root. Maybe we take a log, right? Like it's all we need is like to dampen it a bit. And that concept of kind of saying, yeah. So I think in that first era, they knew what the parameters were and why they were those values. In the middle era, they knew what the parameters were, but not why. And so they probably could say, like, we don't know why this produced better search results, but it does. And we know that this page outranks that one because, this heavily weighted ranking factor, it outweighs all these others. The machine learning end, there are billions of parameters, right? They don't even know, or you can't even hold in a human brain what the parameters are, never mind what their values are. And they don't necessarily map to any kind of sensible human. We don't have languages for these things. We don't have words for these things. So you can't just say this group of parameters relates to quality. This group relates to relevance. This group relates to authority. Like you could do that in the old eras, but in the machine learning era, it's just like, well, there's just billions of parameters and the machine is just spotting patterns that we can't see.
100%. And that's why, to me, a part to make that more understandable are the quality rater questions or the quality rater guidelines and the Panda questions that they release from time to time. That to me kind of tries to bring to the point what these intangible fluid type of signals are that the machine might be looking at. And I think
it tells you what they're optimizing for, doesn't
yeah.
it? Like I think that's the thing is they haven't yet built the oracle, right? Google's machine is not perfectly representing Google's intent, and whereas the quality rater guidelines actually show you what they're trying to do. And I think so actually, and I didn't mention it earlier, but that is another source of our test ideation. So thinking not specifically like rater guidelines, although that might be one of them, but that kind of what would we change if we were trying to impress the people who write the Google algorithm?
Yeah.
Right. You're like, what do we think is the page they want to outperform here? And what would the test be that we think moves us closer to that ideal?
100%. I think we outlined quite a lot. But I think there's one last question to wrap this conversation up, which is looking at all these changes over the last 15 years of your career, the point where you're at now. What keeps you in the game? What keeps you doing SEO after all these years, after all these eras, and after having done so much?
Curiosity. I think fundamentally, I love the fact that we're working with something that's meaningful, right? It's not just an academic game. This drives business outcomes. It creates jobs. It improves all kinds of careers and that side of things. But actually, the thing I get the kick from is it's the problem solving. It's the that's weird. Like why might that be true? Or what do we think? Also, the what do we think might be true tomorrow? Trying to extrapolate our own trends out of this stuff. And it's a game that's kept changing just fast enough to keep me engaged, I guess. It's a great blend of technical enough with enough human interest and enough change that I can stay curious.
Here's to more changes in the future. Will, you're certainly a master of your craft, and this conversation was sheer pleasure for me, and I'm sure for many listeners as well. Besides searchpilot.com, where can people find you and follow you?
Best is Twitter. So I'm at Will Critchlow on Twitter. That's the probably the platform I use most, and from there you can find any other way of contacting me. So start there and let's have a chat about everything from search algorithms, split testing to auction theory or basketball.
Amazing, love it. Thank you so much for coming on, Will.
Thank you for having me. It's been a blast. Appreciate it.
Cool, man. That was straight fire, dude. I could have gone on for hours. Thank you so much. 3, 2, 1.